All my life I have been walking, it would seem, along the right path without even imagining what hell he can lead me into, it seemed. Not long ago I was quite an ordinary person who has a home, a full-time job, family, and a few friends, a man who doesn't need great upheaval and dramatic change, a man without oddities and sound skepticism, who does not believe in mysticism and does not drive acquaintances with dubious personalities. In short, I was the most ordinary, no stand-out average resident of our small city. But as sometimes happens, things can change in an instant. And I ask you, every day pray to the Lord that nothing like this will ever happen to you. Believe me, it is better to live all your life in happy ignorance than just to look into the eyes of absolute horror for a moment. It all started on one unremarkable, cold April morning, as usual. I went to my job. It was somewhere around 8 in the morning. Nothing around it foreshadowed anything unusual. I work on the railway, a crawler of the tracks. I used to walk to our office, only some 15 minutes from home, and now I am already joining the service. I've always taken the same route. These places are familiar to me as 5 fingers. I straddled unhurriedly along the railways, framed on both sides by a gloomy forest belt, the sky not in spring. Hid behind the armada of lead clouds, all silent space covered the shawl of flower fog. It was calm and quiet around. I had the most ordinary routine. Thoughts in my head. Suddenly I saw in front of me some formless shadow that suddenly rose 20 meters from me. I continued to walk in her direction, trying to see the outlines on the move in the fog. It was impossible to understand whether it was a man, animal, or in general, no matter what inanimate object. The closer I got, the clearer the outlines became. Having caught up, I finally saw that it was a girl. She lay on the rails, trying to crawl on them. Her strange and unnatural movements were striking. The hands seemed paralyzed, which caused her to move on the ground like a worm or like a clumsy snake. Her white shroud was smeared with mud and blood. Behind exactly the trail stretched a sticky black train. I decided there was a terrible tragedy and immediately rushed to her to help with something. I leaned over, trying to question what had happened to her. The girl finally noticed me. I moved closer and managed to look at it completely. What he saw immediately led to indescribable shock. Her puppet face and scaly skin were perfectly white, ruffled hair more like some seaweed, and instead of legs, 2 ugly, tentacle-like processes dangled ugly. She looked at me with glass eyes, silently opening her toothless mouth as if a fish washed ashore. It all made me shudder instantly. What was happening seemed somehow unreal and alien. Her dead gaze gave rise to an animal panic in me. I immediately wanted to run away from this place as far as possible, but no sooner had I rushed away than this creature clung tightly to me with thin, bony hands. With a steel grip around my head, it pulled me over, trying to touch me with my faces. I tried unsuccessfully to break out and scream like distraught. The next moment, our views met, mine, frightened and full of despair, and her, cold and indifferent. At that moment, completely inexplicable things began to happen. The face of this creature suddenly began to distort and darkened sharply, turning into some kind of cone-shaped funnel. until it takes the form of a small black hole that absorbs light and the entire surrounding space. It was already useless to break out. I squealed in horror, devoured by a blackening abyss. From all sides I was enveloped in darkness. I felt like I was falling somewhere down. The realization that at any second this fall could end in a deadly meeting with the ground led to indescribable horror. I screamed, but all my screams were barely audible. This usually happens in places where there is nothing to echo from. Without the slightest idea of where I am and what is happening at all, I doomed into the pose of the embryo and already silently continued the endless fall. It's hard to tell how long I've been in this bottomless abyss. At some point, it seemed to me that I saw something unclear under me, a small luminous point, noticeably expanded and grew. I suddenly realized she was coming towards me. However, it was probably me who approached her with incredible speed. Again, thoughts of imminent death engulfed my mind. I shook my hands and feet randomly, exactly drowning. Meanwhile, light has already become a plane. I was really falling below. The first outlines of the landscape began to appear. It resembled a desert with unnaturally orange dunes. The next second I was enveloped in a sudden sandstorm. Sand instantly clogged the eyes and mouth, from which it became impossible to breathe. The last thing we could see was that the earth was already located just a few meters from me, then followed by an incredible force blow. The piercing pain immediately shackled the whole body. I spread out on the sand, not believing that I am still alive. What was happening clearly could not be real. After all, falling from a huge height, people tend to crash and die. A long moan fell out of my mouth. I coughed up, and I think I vomited. The shock state made me instantly jump to my feet, shaking off the remains of sand from my clothes and face. I looked around carefully. An endless desert flooded around, some unusual, exactly from films about flights to other planets. There are tall red cacti on the horizon, with crown corals curling into spirals. In some places, miniature craters smelled of gray and burnt rags. I looked up and saw a rusty, sultry sky, nor was it the way we were used to. Everything in this world seemed alien and hostile. It's probably crazy or hallucinating, I was thinking. Probably I fell into a coma, and now I see a nightmare lethargic dream. Nothing in the world could convince me of the reality of what is happening. The midday sun, of unprecedented size, melted the air and burned the skin. There was unbearable heat. I wiped sweat from my forehead and took a few steps, I thought, east. Someone's footprints were visible on the sand. It looks like the huge snakes crawled here inches apart. Not understanding why, I moved towards the leading trace. I walked in. With each step the forces left me. The legs became cotton and bogged down in the sand. My chest was still sore after the impact, and I could hardly swallow the hot air. The same surreal landscape was visible everywhere. The world seemed to be frozen in freeze-frame mode. Only calm was unexpectedly replaced by hot sandstorms that came in, not the news from where, which ended as suddenly as they began. I walked probably a few kilometers before I fell from powerlessness, continuing for some time my way crawling. I suddenly noticed that I began to twist her. The sun went down, and it was no longer so unbearably hot. For the first time in all this time, suddenly told the life-giving coolness. I swallowed with a dry mouth. The head was splitting with squinting pain. Having finally lost my strength, and with them a sound mind, I fell asleep right in the open air. The last thing I felt, a scrap of consciousness, was how someone unknown and invisible to date, jumping up to me, immediately began to avidly tear my flesh. Using something like a beak for this, I felt unbearable pain, but I no longer had the strength to resist. I realized I was dying. Then I hovered long and gently in absolute darkness, surrounded by deafening silence. I could not feel my body. All senses seemed atrophied. Only somewhere in the depths of what was left of me pulsed, giving off warmth, an obscure sound similar to white noise. Something inside told me the place was called the house. The sound grew smoothly, becoming clearer at one point. I thought I could see him. The sound took shape and resembled a TV screen with a downed channel. Thousands of twinkling dots on a gray back. Ground crumbled in infinity. The hiss of the ether drew colors. The world around me began to take on a brighter shape. I even found out where I was now. The railway is framed by a forest belt, the one that once. In another life I went so often. Now I lay on the tracks wrapped in a bloody, dirty shroud. My hands did not obey me. My legs became like long tentacles, and wet, tangled hair hung from my head. I started crawling, wriggling like a worm, in search of a living soul. I ask you, every day pray to the Lord that nothing like this will ever happen to you. As long as the lead clouds tightly shackle the sky of this gloomy world, and the milk mist flows out of the morning marshes, live in blissful ignorance, and do not even think of looking into the eyes of absolute horror. I see a girl in front of me. She approaches me warily. Her gaze is full of fear and bewilderment. She's trying to say something, but I can't make out the words. For another moment, and my fingers dig into her head. The girl screams and tries to escape. I feel her animal fear. A startled gaze full of despair begs for mercy. She just doesn't understand that I don't wish her any harm. Her life will never be the same again. I'll take her out of here with me, to the place where she will be absolutely happy. I'll take her to our quiet house. That evening, duty began as usual, a normal working day, or rather a night, a couple of corpses, and you can safely go on a day off. But those customers turned out to be special. They were brought in a God's woes. Usually in such undertakers, they transport the bodies of homeless people, decomposed to a state of jelly or mummified, partially skeletonized remains of poor fellows, which they could not find during. The corpses were unloaded. They were packed in double rubberized bags intended for the transportation of biological remains. For fidelity, they were wrapped in cellophane, tied with twine for more comfortable transportation. This fact itself, for understanding people, spoke of many things, which means, most likely, you will have to deal with decomposing, oozing pus and worm-covered material. Not that it was new to me, but of course I would prefer something simpler. I didn't want to be smeared from head to toe with biological secretions of corpses. On the gurney of my test subjects delivered the room. I was lucky. given that the bodies were to bosses allocated me to help the shift pathologist. Egger was a good surgeon in the past, and it was considered a great success to get an appointment with him until one day a patient died on his operating table. The forensic examination revealed violations during operations, and Yeager was accused of everything. He was removed from his post, but the love for the occupation of his whole life remained, so he got a job as a duty pathologist in the morgue by my rival. Yeager had already put on a working uniform and gloves. Then a couple of minutes later, he added a protective mask. He was removed from his post, but the love for the occupation of his whole life remained, so he got a job as a duty pathologist in the morgue by my rival. Yeager had already put on a working uniform and gloves. Then a couple of minutes later, he added a protective mask. "Well, what special case do we have today?" I asked, carefully tying the apron on the belt. "I don't know yet. The corpses of a man and a woman, found on the edge of the forest. They are at least 2 weeks old. The cause of death has not been determined. Well, now we will install the bro." Smiling, I said, and approached the players standing on the window, pressed the button, and the room filled the sounds of the radio. "Well, what was driven?" Yeager said, and began to unpack the terrible bundle. When the bags were finished, a sad picture opened up before our eyes. The corpses were in a terrible state, exuding a terrible stench. They were charcoal black, with their bodies more like jelly leaking a lot of liquid during transport, giving off a pungent smell vaguely resembling a mixture of rotten cheese and rotten vegetables. "Who do you take, a man or a woman?" I asked Yeager. He shrugged, making it clear, 100 to him on the drum of whom to open. "Let's flip the coin. The tails will be a female corpse," and I suggested a male eagle. Having thrown a coin, I watched with a fading heart how it made several full turns, fell on my palm. A tails fell out, and so I had to explore the female-bodied, and Yeager got a man accordingly. We got down to business. I had already managed to quickly examine the body of a woman. She, apparently, was no more than 30. Her body was slim, without a hint of excess weight. Police officers seized her clothes to conduct an examination, so she lay in her pristine and rotting beauty. The fact that any insects, whether worms or larvae, were completely absent from her body did not escape my attention. I, by sinful deed, caught myself thinking that even the stench comes from her, somewhat different than from her fellow in misfortune. 1. "Have you already established the cause of death?" exclaimed Yeager. I made the music quieter and answered, "No, and I have already managed. The death of my ward is caused by a ruptured aorta and numerous injuries to the neck and chest. Now I will conduct an autopsy, and I can tell you something else. My partner told me, and he also has no heart. It was as if he was uprooted from his chest. HMM. It's quite strange." Yeager added quietly. I, with double zeal, set to work, making a cut spread the chest in both directions, and then I saw that some sharp object, similar to the arrowhead, was sticking out of her heart. Taking the forceps, I extracted it. It turned out to be a sharp part of the spear, and it was made of some kind of wood that was unknown to me, strong and incredibly solid. Looking closely, I distinguished on its surface some tiny letters, very similar to Latin. "And here I am, Yeager. They stabbed my client with a wooden stake. Cruel and inhuman. I said, and began to work on suddenly. It seemed to me that the body of the deceased woman became a little warmer. Not much, of course, but still, no, it just can't be, I thought. Goosebumps ran through the body, and wanting to save myself from doubts, I took out an electronic thermometer, put it to the body of the corpse. When I, waiting for the due time, looked at the testimony, I almost fainted. Her body temperature was 33 degrees. I knew that there was a powerful air conditioner in the prosector room, so there was no more than 20 degrees in the section room, which means that its temperature was an order of magnitude higher than that of the environment. To be honest, this is the first time I've encountered something like this in almost 15 years of work. With this dead stranger, there was clearly something wrong. I decided to continue my research further, trying to ignore the warm, rotten muscle tissue of the girl's stomach. Its contents caused me, a seasoned and cynical pathologist, an attack of rapid vomiting. Edgar ran up to me and excitedly asked, "Brathen, why did you eat something wrong?" "Yes, no, I ate what is necessary, but this creature definitely devoured something wrong." I squeezed out through force, wiping my mouth with my sleeve. Edgar bowed over the incision and bounced back in shock, not believing his eyes. The dead girl's stomach was clogged with raw meat. Having folded a mosaic of pieces of flesh, I recognized in the resulting likeness the most important human organ, heart. This creature devoured him not long before he died, and we both understood who was her victim. I felt uneasy. Thoughts of a mysterious object in the heart of a female corpse and fever, as well as the contents of her stomach wrapped in her head as part of a devil's puzzle. Suddenly, in the sectional hall, it smelled sharply of ozone. Daylight lamps flashed like crazy beacons. There was a crack, as if from high voltage, and light bulbs scattered as if they were filled with gunpowder. We were in pitch darkness. "Edgar, I need to leave here urgently," quietly whispered, and then we both heard that sound. It was like a lamb carcass falling off a hook in a slaughterhouse. The hair on my head moved. Probably in horror, it became cramped under the medical cap. In the ringing silence of the hall, timid sounds rang out, and then more confident, shuffling steps. I backed my back to the door, realizing that my partner was standing somewhere in the corner. "Jaeger, run! Run faster!" I shouted, feeling that something unimaginable would begin now. Taking the smartphone out of my pocket, I turned on the backlight and pointed it at the table where the dead woman was lying. To our general horror, it turned out to be empty. "What the hell did she go?" I said with a trembling voice. But Jaeger did not give me a heartbreaking cry. It was full of unbearable pain and anguish. So screams the doe, which the hungry lion begins to tear apart while still alive with a trembling hand. I brought a ray of light to the sound source and shook from the horror that surrounded me. My colleague was lying on the floor, and a dead creature dug into his throat. She cheated avidly, grumbling in utero, as if she hadn't eaten for 1,000,000 years. "Ah, you bitch!" I shouted and grabbed the scalpel, rushed to her. She flashed as black as charcoal eyes. Greedy her mouth. I always dealt with the tool skillfully and at one time. On the course, I was one of the best. I hit her straight under the lower jaw. There are a lot of blood vessels and a carotid artery. No matter what it is, it was zipped in my head with lightning. But I didn't know that what was already dead was almost impossible to kill. Scalpel entered the jelly-like body like a cup with kyselum, but did not even lead the undead, even with her ear, but intercepted my hand, jerked at herself with a jerk. I have never experienced such pain before. The taste of Jaeger's blood, the deceased tattered strength. The insides fell out of her torn at the opening of the abdomen, but this did not bother the dead. In this mouth they fell. It was full of teeth, which she instantly snapped my hand in half, and it hung limp on a piece of skin, threatening to come off completely with an incredible effort. I escaped from the clutches of a devilish creature and crawled to the locker with drugs. Having opened it with one hand, I found containers with alcohol. It happened after a particularly difficult day. We drank it with my unfortunate partner, but now apparently with Jaeger, no longer sit at the same table. He lay at the window in a pool of blood, indifferent to everything that was happening. Because of the injury, I was in a state of shock, but the pain went away and I clearly knew what to do. Come on, damn image. Come here, I beckoned a fetid creature, and she, hot with her legs, moved to meet me. I began to throw containers of alcohol at her. She squinted incomprehensibly and writhed terrible grimaces. Soon, she was doused from head to toe. I felt like I was losing consciousness because of the loss of blood. And then I set fire to paper and threw it into a dead creature. There was a pop, and the evaporation of alcohol flared up with such force that the windows in the hall immediately flew out. Undead, like a burning torch, rushed through the hall, making a uterine roar. It stank of burnt, rotten meat. From the heat, my apron melted, spreading over my wounded skin. I woke up already in intensive care, with 50% of body burns. Instead of my right hand, there was a charred stump. They say that from my partner, Jaeger, only a handful of ashes and a dental crown remained. What it was, I still can't understand. They told me that after the fire I had set, the entire morgue with his wards burned down cleanly. So the dead died a second time, and I hope that that vile creature die. Indeed, could she not survive in such a bake? Couldn't. At least I really want to believe it.